Whereas this NDP government agreed to hand over $590 million to 6 corporations, only to watch them lay off 1,310 Nova Scotians. $225 million of that went to Bowater and Port Hawkesbury Paper, companies that slashed wages, rolled back benefits, and left pensioners in the cold. Therefore, be it resolved that the member for Halifax Needham still supports the Premier's inaction on power rates and their failure to improve wages, and that is hurting this province and the people in the riding of Halifax Needham. I'm not asking.
Motion is tabled. Orders of the day, oral questions put by members to ministers. The time is now 12:55. We will finish at 1:55. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier's Economic Development Minister refuses to release the IBM contract when asked. The NDP once said government deals with big business must be tabled and debated in this House so that Nova Scotians could see how their tax dollars are being used. Mr. Speaker, on November 16, 2006, the Premier said, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, this is a plan to centralize and then outsource important government functions without any discussion on the plan. These kinds of decisions should be discussed publicly, given careful consideration before they are approved, yet the government has not reported this plan in any public document. The people who will pay the price are being kept in the dark, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, it is this Premier who is now keeping the people who will pay for the big deal with IBM in the dark. So my question to the Premier, why is the Premier, a man who once stood for openness and transparency, now hiding his deal from the view and scrutiny of the people of this province?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, in fact, we signed, along with, I believe, the leader of the Liberal Party and the leader of the Conservative Party at the time, a public service protection agreement that lays out very clearly 4 or 5 steps that have to be met when these kinds of things take place. Indeed, we engaged thoroughly in that process, ensured that particularly the employees understood what the ramifications were. Of course, the contractual arrangements are part of the negotiation, takes place with the department. There are commercial aspects to that, so far from not being prepared to release it, we're simply insisting that the Freedom of Information Office, which is the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Office, actually have an opportunity to do their job.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
It's interesting how the minister hides behind the Office of the Privacy Officer in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, when they wouldn't even show the deal to the privacy officer before they started. Mr. Speaker, this Premier once stood in this House and demanded openness and transparency on behalf of Nova Scotians. This Premier also once stood with the middle class instead of with big business. On April 30th, 2002, the Premier said, and I quote, "Whenever I mention the kind of corporate welfare that they engage in, it causes a great deal of nattering among them. You know, oh no, they shouldn't be saying that. People are going to get upset. Our constituents are going to be mad at us." And here we go again. Well, it's true. That's what they are doing. They're taking money out of the pockets of the middle-class taxpayers, the poor, the people on minimum wage. And who are they giving it to? They're giving it to the wealthy, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, this government just signed a $100 million deal with IBM, the 9th largest corporation in the world. IBM is worth $213.7 billion, Mr. Speaker, with $106.9 billion in revenue last year. My question to the Premier, why is the government more concerned about the protection and reputation of the 9th largest corporation in the world than the government is about being open and transparent with Nova Scotians?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this does exactly the opposite. That quote that he just read, this one actually does exactly the opposite. This is a payroll rebate, which means that the onus is on IBM to actually create the jobs and then retrospectively audit it in arrears. The government looks at the tax that has already been paid, nets out some back to IBM, and then takes the balance of that money and provides the services to the middle class, to the poor, to seniors that they need. This is, in fact, about making money and putting it in the hands of people who need it and giving them the services they require.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final compliment.
Speaker, I wonder if the Premier read the deal before he signed it. What he did actually was give an untendered sole source contract to IBM for $84 million before, Mr. Speaker, he decided to add to them and give them $12.4 million in payroll rebates. Mr. Speaker, to add further insult to the people of this province, he's given IBM access to preferential treatment when it comes to future outsourcing of this government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government sides with big business over the middle class. The government is choosing corporate welfare over developing a sound economic vision. The people who voted for the NDP and all Nova Scotians were truly disappointed with this government. Mr. Speaker, they're disappointed because the NDP once stood against these deals. On November 4th, 1999, the Deputy Premier said, and I quote, "Where is the economic vision?" End of quote. He criticized a government deal with Scotiabank, a company 4 times smaller than IBM, saying, and I quote, "We were just here a few weeks ago and the Minister of Economic Development went on and said, we had this glorious announcement to make. We are going to give money to Scotiabank, that poor company, just barely scraping by. We have got to give them money to help them attract business to Nova Scotia," Mr. Speaker, end of quote. IBM, Daewoo, Irving, the biggest of the big. We have yet to see the contracts from any of these deals. This government is hiding, Mr. Speaker, and the government does not want Nova Scotians to know the truth. So my question to the Premier, why is the government afraid to show Nova Scotians the contracts they are signing with big business?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, one of the things, first of all, on the day that we announced the support to ensure that Irving Shipyards was able to win the largest industrial contract in our history, we actually released all of the information with respect to that. Agreement. He disagrees. The Leader of the Opposition criticizes all of these things, but he never says what he would do or what he wouldn't do, Mr. Speaker, because, of course, past Liberal governments created the rebate program. Past Liberal governments invested in companies like Dynatech that went bankrupt, like Arenda Recip, another one that went bankrupt. We remember these, Mr. Speaker. The simple fact of the matter is, this is a government that is engaged in economic development activities that are creating thousands of jobs. And you know something? The Liberal Party hates that. They hate that because they are job killers.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we all know by now, Nova Scotia Power is asking for a 6% increase in our power rates over the next 2 years. What we just found out recently, however, is that last week the Chief Financial Officer of their parent company, Emera, told a Toronto audience that they traded a quarter point on their guaranteed profit in order to get a 2-year increase prior to the next provincial election. I will table that for the benefit of the House. My question to the Premier is this: why are the interests of Emera so closely aligned with those of the NDP?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think they'd see it that way, given the legislation that's right now before the House, in which we set the table for ensuring fair power rates for the province, Mr. Speaker. What I will say, though, is this. As I understand it, the general rate application that was before the board was signed on to by the Small Business Advocate, by the Consumer Advocate, and by any number of parties, one of which was not the Government of Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that trade-off happened as part of a backroom deal that we opposed at the URB, and I didn't see the NDP represented there to stand up for Nova Scotians who are not being well served by these backroom deals at the time. Mr. Speaker, the Chief Financial Officer for Emera says that the agreement that the Premier is describing results in a healthy increase in actual power rates. As we know, under the Premier's watch, power rates have gone up by 25%. So I'll ask the Premier, why does the Premier allow these backroom deals to happen when they so clearly are not working for Nova Scotia families?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't assess whether they are working or don't work. They are before the Utility and Review Board, who approves or not approves the agreements as they come forward. But the reason why we fund a consumer advocate, for example, is to just, in particular, is to make sure that the interests of consumers are actually protected. So when they sign these agreements, my assumption is, and I think the assumption broadly would be, that he signs on to them because he believes that they result in the best position for consumers vis-a-vis the power company.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Emera Chief Financial Officer says that getting a 2-year deal was important to them because elections are, and I quote, distracting. That is an insult to every member of this House and to every voting Nova Scotians, who, by the way, are also the customers of the power company. Believing that elections are a distraction and they need to do a trade-off behind closed doors taints the entire backroom deal settlement process. And so I will ask the Premier, will he order that the URB set aside this tainted deal and freeze power rates in their tracks right now?
Honourable the Premier.
I'm not sure. Did he just say taints the backroom deal? Was that what I heard him say? Mr. Speaker, look, I'll tell you something. I read. First of all, there's a number of things. One is that there's a bill currently before the House that forces Emera to actually have multi-year deals, and I think those are a good thing. They should have multi-year. Applications so that people have a reasonable idea of what their position is going to look like over the years to come. That's the first thing. The second thing is I read the comments of the CFO, and I have to say I thought they were extraordinarily insensitive, and they, do not represent, especially for a company who, when they are applying the decisions that they get from the Utility Review Board, affect the everyday lives of people in the province. And to talk about increases being healthy or distractions, I mean, I think it is. I think in that much he's absolutely right. It's insulting and extraordinarily insensitive. But if you want to deal with that, then you have to talk to Nova Scotia Power. It's not something that the government approves of. Unfortunately, they're a private company. They create it. We have to deal with it on that basis.
Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, the Premier decided to lash out at the opposition parties, Mr. Speaker. He didn't like the way we questioned his deal with projects, a deal that gives Nova Scotia tax dollars to an Albertan company to compete with Nova Scotia businesses, Mr. Speaker. Then the engineering sector was not consulted with before the government made this decision or announcement. So my question to the Premier, why didn't the government consult with the major business stakeholders before making this deal?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know where the Leader of the Opposition gets his information, but I can't think of a group that we're in to see us more times than the consulting engineers. Simple fact that that's exactly right. We consulted the consulting engineers. They consulted us. Mr. Speaker, I got to say, this is about 440 jobs that will go to young people in this province, that will strengthen the labour pool, that will increase the payroll alone on this will be about $40 million or $50 million a year, Mr. Speaker. This is good for the engineers. It's good for young people. It keeps them here. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, it brings people home from Alberta who otherwise would be doing the work there.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Speaker can make light of the concerns by the Consulting Engineers Association of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, but I think they at least deserve the respect of the members of this House for the work that they've been doing on behalf of all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the Premier, by growing their industry during the worst recession, at the same time his government has been failing to grow the economy of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the NDP blasted the Conservative government of the day for using tax dollars to subsidize out-of-province competition, Mr. Speaker, against Nova Scotia companies. I think they might want to pay attention to this, Mr. Speaker. On May 6, 2008, the Premier said, and I quote, "When the Premier was first elected in 1999, his government promised it would never use public money to back enterprises that would compete with our existing private sector businesses." End of quote, Mr. Speaker. He continued and asked, and he said, and I quote, "Orrin has been blindsided by the announcement, so I ask you, why did you not consult with the major business stakeholders before you made the Gateway announcement?" End of quote. So my question to the Premier, why did the Premier demand that past governments perform such consultations while it is clear this government failed to do so?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, maybe he didn't hear the answer, but the reality is that the consulting engineers were in to talk to us about their concerns, and we weighed them, Mr. Speaker. But the simple fact of the matter is we're talking about 440 well-paying jobs for Nova Scotians. There are advertisements up in the airports in Calgary and Fort McMurray bringing home young people that we have shipped off to Alberta for years, Mr. Speaker, so that they can come home, start their families, raise their kids, and be part of the economy of Nova Scotia. And the Leader of the Opposition complains about that, but he has no answer. He has no answer except to say, you should just kill these jobs.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that sounds like the speech the Premier gave when he was talking about DSTN, Mr. Speaker. Remember the 500 jobs that were going to appear in Pictou County, Mr. Speaker? And the hundreds of Nova Scotians that were going to be summoned home for those jobs, Mr. Speaker? Well, his rhetoric is falling on deaf ears because Nova Scotians don't believe it anymore, Mr. Speaker, the Premier has wrongly insisted that the project's deal is not subsidized competition. He needs to consult no further, Mr. Speaker, than his party's past before making such outlandish statements, Mr. Speaker. On November 7, 2006, the former NDP member for Dartmouth East said, and I quote, "Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Economic Development. Last September, NSBI, Nova Scotia Business Inc., announced payroll rebates for Crepe Geomatics, an Albertan firm, Mr. Speaker, to establish in Nova Scotia to hire 75 geomatic techs. Mr. Speaker, the announcement came as a complete shock to local companies, and they are still feeling the impact. Locally owned firms have lost personnel to Crepe Geomatics and their government-subsidized salaries. My question to the Minister is, I'd like to ask you, why did NSBI not consult with the local geomatic sector before making this investment decision?" End of quote. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier. In 2006, payroll rebates to an Albertan company counted as government-subsidized competition, but today they don't. What has changed?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I know one thing for sure. Probably the most disappointed person in the province when DSTN landed their new contract was probably the Leader of the Opposition, because they're opposed to success in Pictou County. They're opposed to any job, Mr. Speaker. They wouldn't have put any money into Port Hawkesbury. They would have allowed 1,000 jobs to go out the window there. They wouldn't put any money into DSTN. They'll let the jobs there go out of the province. They won't put any money into projects, Mr. Speaker. They'll let them stay in Alberta. Mr. Speaker, they criticize IBM. You know, you have to kind of wonder, what in the name of God would the Leader of the Opposition actually do besides criticize?
Nothing. The Honourable Member from Richmond.
It was governed.
Mr. Speaker, the untendered deal signed by this government with IBM to take over the government's SAP computer system has Nova Scotians asking whether it's a good deal for taxpayers and whether their private information will be protected. Mr. Speaker, the NDP have never been a fan of outsourcing government IT work. On November 16, 2006, the former finance minister and member for Halifax Fairview said, while in opposition, quote, "You would think the government would have learned its lessons about outsourcing the information technology function. The eMERGE project has been, quite simply, a budgetary disaster. But the government can still not guarantee that this runaway train, which started with an unsolicited private sector proposal and which was continued without a public tender, won't need more public money. Now, apparently, it's too late for the government to back out." End quote. My question is, why won't the Premier table the untendered deal signed with IBM so Nova Scotians can decide whether the NDP government is making the same mistakes they criticized the Conservative government for making in 2006?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, it was a kind of a mishmash of stuff, so I'll answer some of it and he can decide whether or not it answers his question. The simple fact of the matter is that the arrangement with IBM actually retains all of the government information on the government servers, so that the protections for them are the same. In terms of the operations, the standards associated with the operations for that equipment are either the same as were in place before or were greater, Mr. Speaker, to protect privacy and to ensure that people have their information properly protected.
The honourable member for Richmond on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this Premier's secrecy around these big deals could easily lead one to believe that his past statements while in opposition about the importance of openness and transparency in government contracts were disingenuous at best. We know the Premier nor anyone in his government consulted with the province's privacy officer. Now we know why. Instead, they paid Barrington Consulting Group $34,000 for a report which they refused to show us, and we're now left to ask whether the tender for Barrington Consulting Group was ever put out to tender or whether that was sole sourced as well. But Mr. Speaker, it's not just the opposition who have concerns with this government actions. Now Mr. Darcy Fardy, the former privacy officer in Nova Scotia, is speaking out against this government secrecy. Darcy Fardy commented on the IBM deal and said, quote, "There can be no good reason," end quote, "for the Premier's insistence on hiding the IBM contract." He added, quote, "It's not unreasonable to suspect that the requirement for formal application through freedom of information is a stalling tactic by the Premier and his government," end quote. So my question to the Premier is, why does the Premier continue to hide from Nova Scotians the untendered deal he signed with IBM that will cost Nova Scotia taxpayers over $100 million?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I just point out, first of all, it's cost neutral to us. It doesn't cost us any additional money. In fact, that was the very structure of the agreement. So, Mr. Speaker, the contractual arrangement that has been made is a contract that I think exceeds 800 pages. It is being reviewed by the Freedom of Information Protection of Privacy officers. They need time to be able to do that, and that's a perfectly understandable, reasonable, and accountable way to do business.
The honourable member for Richmond on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that sounds a bit like the responses that we would have heard from the former Conservative government. And the reaction from the NDP while in opposition was that they actually took the government to court over freedom of information. In fact, the Premier's own Director of Communication, his Chief of Staff, brought legal action in Nova Scotia about the previous Conservative government's refusal to disclose information under freedom of information. Ironically, I should point out that their lawyer, or representative in that case, was none other than the member for Halifax Fairview in fighting for openness in government. So, Mr. Speaker, apparently that was then, this is now. The Premier stands in his place and tells us it's a great deal, yet as opposition and Nova Scotians have absolutely no means of judging the merits of his statements, and his secrecy, he knows, is causing that. Mr. Speaker, in a case heard in the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia in 1997, Justice William Kelly described as the basic purpose of our Freedom of Information Act is, quote, "to ensure the public has the information necessary to make an informed assessment of the performance of its government institutions," end quote. Mr. Speaker, in light of that need for openness, if the Premier truly believes this is a great deal for Nova Scotia taxpayers, what are you hiding?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Richmond actually mischaracterizes almost every part of that. That was a decision that was associated with a post Freedom of Information Protection of Privacy decision, Mr. Speaker. So they went through the process and then denied the contract. All we are asking for, and I believe this is perfectly reasonable, is to ensure that we respect the commercial nature of an agreement between a government and a company, so that the Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy has the authority, has the oversight responsibility. They would have us take away that responsibility and just throw it out the window, I suppose. But they have that responsibility. We're simply asking them to exercise that responsibility, and when they come back, they'll make a decision on which, perhaps all of it, will be released, and we'll respect that decision.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on May the 8th, under questioning in this House, the Minister of Energy admitted that, and I quote from Hansard, about 1 to 2% is the cost of renewables on our electricity bill. Mr. Speaker, apparently he thinks that is a reasonable thing to ask of Nova Scotians, even though no one asked them. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, we know Nova Scotians have made it clear they cannot afford to pay more on their electricity bill. So my question to the Premier is, does the Premier agree with his Minister of Energy that his policies are in fact driving up our power rates?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, in fact, if you look back, it is actually the cost of fossil fuels that drove up. So every time we look at a general rate application, we have to look at it in comparison with what the alternative would be. So the alternative would be to continue to tie ourselves to fossil fuels that are erratic and would, of course, increase at perhaps a much faster rate than renewables would. So this is part of the renewable electricity plan. It's been vetted by experts in the area, but it's also just a very common sense thing. Whatever decision you make is an alternative to whatever other decision that you might make. But I would ask one more thing, Mr. Speaker, before the Leader of the Conservative Party gets back on his feet, when he stands up to ask his next question, perhaps he would tell which community in Nova Scotia the renewable contract he would cancel, which project would not go ahead if he had his way.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, every time that Nova Scotians look at an NDP pre-election promise from now on, they will have to look at what the alternative will be. And the alternative is what the NDP actually do when they get into office. That's what we've learned when it comes to our power rates. Mr. Speaker, under the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act in 2007, this House, under unanimous agreement, set some important environmental goals and some important economic goals, like growing our provincial economy at the rate of the national average or better each year, something the NDP has failed to accomplish every year that they've been in office. And one of the reasons is the 25% increase in our power rates. Mr. Speaker, the President of Nova Scotia Power said at the UARB just last month, quote, "We've been consistently reporting that the impact of the renewables program overall on a levelized basis is an increase in power rates of 1 to 2% per year over the time frame of the program." Mr. Speaker, will the Premier help struggling Nova Scotians by instructing Nova Scotia Power to build as much renewable energy as they can within the current rates?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, over the last number of years, power rates have been driven up, but they haven't been driven up by renewables. They've been driven up by the fact that we have been handcuffed to the international fossil fuel markets. So every time when the cost of coal went up by 75%, that was directly reflected in the cost of energy to consumers in this province. That is what drove up power rates in Nova Scotia. It is renewables that is going to stabilize them.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, we have seen exactly what stabilize means under the NDP. Stabilize means up 25%, and that is exactly the problem. Mr. Speaker, soon the UARB will make a decision on the most recent additional 6% that Nova Scotia Power is asking of all of us. They will make that decision on the basis of the NDP electricity plan, which the Premier's own Minister of Energy says adds 1 to 2% of that 3% every year for the life of the program onto the power bills of Nova Scotians. So right now, the Premier has an opportunity to actually give Nova Scotians real power rate relief. And so I asked the Premier, will he freeze rates today by rewriting his electricity plan before the UARB makes its decision?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is, perhaps he just ignores this, but the cost of power went up because of decisions that were made by former Conservative and Liberal governments. When they had Nova Scotia Power, they built generating capacity. They built it on the basis of coal-fired generating. When the price of coal went up, that drives up the cost of energy to consumers. Now, those were decisions that were made, and at the time, why were they made? They were made because coal was a cheap fuel at the time. And I'm sure that governments of the day believed that that was the right decision to make. But the result was that they tied themselves to the international fossil fuel market, and when it goes haywire, all of us pay the price. That is the result of the policy that was put in place. We put in place a policy that has a fully hedged a portfolio of energy so that we can use some coal, we can use natural gas, we can use hydro, we can use wind, and as the various commodities change in price, we can ramp up one and ramp down the other, and that provides rate stability.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my question is also for the Premier. And I'd like to give the Premier the opportunity to clarify some of the statements he made the other day in question period when he was asked about his travel habits. Mr. Speaker, the Premier, I will assume that he misspoke, and I would like to give him that opportunity to correct himself. Mr. Speaker, on 2 trips totaling more than $15,000, when the Premier was asked why he flew in executive class, he said, quote, "It's simply the ability to be able to sleep, and this is the major difference you get in that class of service." Unfortunately, according to the Premier's own calendar, and according to his statements even to the media at the time, and I certainly don't mind tabling that, of course, he was scheduled to take the next day off when he came back from China so that he could sleep. And I'm sure the movie was very good on that flight back, but Mr. Speaker, if the...
That's enough.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this was the reason that the Premier gave to this House the other day, and the quote was just right. We just tabled that, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. Order. That is unparliamentary. I would ask the honourable member to withdraw that remark, please. Stand up. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you. I withdraw the remark.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East has the floor. A question, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question.
Thank you.
Question.
I would ask
Question.
I'm asking the question. Yes. The question is.
Or I'll move to the next one.
No, I'm
Go ahead. Ask it.
Why weren't you available to the media upon your return if, according to your staff, you had to sleep?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, to this House, I said no such thing, just to be clear. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I work as the chair of the Council of Federation. I work on behalf not only of the people of this province, but of course the people of the country. I led a delegation of all of the premiers in order to be able to advance the trade interests of our country. Now, one of the things about the question that is being asked by the member is that he can ask that question because I table my expenses and he can see them. He can see them. He can go and have a look at them. They're tabled down in the Howe room. He can see them, and he can ask the question, and people can decide whether or not these are reasonable things. Does he agree that's appropriate for a public official?
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my expenses are online every month. So, Mr. Speaker, the fact is, Mr. Speaker, it's a simple question. I tabled the remarks by the Premier where he suggested the reason he chose to fly executive class, and that's his choice, was because he needed to sleep. And fine. You know, but the question is, his own calendar and his own staff wouldn't make him available the next day. You know, Mr. Speaker, this is a Premier that asked people to accept $65 million cut in education, a $100 million cut from universities, a 2% increase in the HST. He asked others to take sacrifices that he wouldn't take. So, Mr. Speaker, why didn't the Premier believe that he should take a sacrifice just like other Premiers did and fly economy while he was asking others to accept cuts?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, first of all the numbers that he quoted are wrong. That's the first thing, but that's not unusual. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, the work that I do on behalf of the people of the province is important. It is not to be belittled or demeaned. Of course, we have many calls upon our time when we come back from trips, whether or not we're available to the press or not. There's, especially after we've been away, there's lots and lots of work to be done. And as I'm sure the member understands, this is not a 8-hour-a-day, 5-day-a-week job. The work that we do, in fact, all the members of the government are on call constantly, and that's just a fact of the life we chose. But I want to come back to this because he does get to ask these questions, and he does because the leader, the Premier of the province, has to be in a position to make sure that there is complete scrutiny of their expenses. They file them. In fact, they put them in a binder right down by the press, so that the press can have the opportunity to actually look through them and ensure. So there's nothing that he said or nothing that he tabled in this House that wouldn't have been available to the press. It is from the day that it is from the day that it is filed. So does he agree that for a public official that is an appropriate way for a disclosure?
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, when the Premier is in opposition after the next election, he'll get to ask all the questions he wants. But the Premier is not answering the questions he's being asked. And what I do believe is that it's appropriate for a public official to actually answer the questions they're asked. And the Premier has refused to do that this entire session on any issue. Mr. Speaker, it's really quite simple. This is a party that complained about the coffee being used in the Department of Education when they were in opposition, and now they're worried. It's unbelievable that the Premier would then criticize such a legitimate question. So, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier. Obviously, as the Premier said, there's lots of business to do, and the other day I spoke and I said that many of these trade missions are important. The Premier also tends to travel with people, as we would expect the Premier to do. Will the Premier table in this House a list of all the staff that travelled with him, or departmental or Premier staff who travelled with him, and what class they flew in for these 2 trips?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, that information is available through the various avenues that not the least of which is public accounts that the member has. I point out the fact that we make sure that we provide all this information from my office for the reasons of transparency, and so that these questions can be asked. I did that not just when I became Premier, but I did that for many years as the Leader of the Opposition, so that even as the Leader of the Opposition, people could see what it is that we spend on travel. So maybe, Mr. Speaker, before the member for Dartmouth East stands up again, maybe he might just lean forward and whisper in the ear of the Leader of the Opposition, see if maybe he will file some of his expenses, seeing how he hasn't filed a single solitary one since the day he became the Leader of the Opposition.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice has resisted calls for a public process
disagreement between two members.
Facilitate healing and uncover what happened at the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children.
Just wait. Just hold on.
When I rule in the chamber. Same as any other speaker before me, Wayne. Yeah, and I'll rule on it. I'll rule on it when the time comes. That's right. My rule is final. You're going to rule on it before you do? No, I'm not. I'm just going to tell him I'm going to rule. He said he'll figure it out, but I'm ruling on it when the time comes. Like any other speaker before me, in the House here, the speaker ruling is final. Am I right? You're right, but Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. The honourable member Victoria the Lakes has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me begin again. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Justice has resisted calls for a public process to facilitate healing and uncover what happened at the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children. The Premier continues to hide behind the ongoing court case. The Minister of Justice ignored Professor Wayne McKay's expertise on the issue when he said that a public inquiry would serve a useful purpose. He pointed out that the law is pretty clear that you can have the two run in a parallel fashion. So, Mr. Speaker, the Premier has nothing left to hide behind. So my question through you to the Premier, with the legal obstacles eliminated, will he finally agree to form a commission to develop a public forum for the former residents of the Home for Coloured Children?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if the member has a suggestion, I would be pleased to receive it. In fact, what I have said is exactly the same thing at the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children. The Board of Directors has already said. They said that they were prepared to have an inquiry take place so long as it did not interfere with the investigation taking place of the criminal charges into the allegations that were made against certain staff at the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children, and as long as it did not affect the disposition of the class action suit that is currently before the courts. So, and I understand it's before the courts for the purposes of certification at this point, but it will go forward as full-blown litigation. And what I have said is that any additional process would have to be appropriate, and it would have to be appropriate giving weight to those things that are also of concern to the Board of Directors. So, of course, Mr. Speaker, if the member has a suggestion, if he has something that he thinks is useful for the government to consider, I would be happy to have him tender it.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one can call the inquiry but the Premier and the government itself. And the Commission can make a determination as to what's brought before the inquiry interferes with the legal cases that are before the courts. They can be the ones to decide, but in order for an inquiry to take place, it's up to the government to call that inquiry. Mr. Speaker, not only have the experts weighed in and swept aside the government's excuse regarding the legal proceedings, the Home itself, as the Premier has mentioned, is in support of a public forum. The Home for Coloured Children issued a release yesterday indicating their support, and it read, and I quote, "We have no objection if the Nova Scotian government decides to hold a public inquiry into these serious allegations, so long as it didn't slow the criminal proceedings. The Premier has not shown any inclination that he wishes to move the court proceedings along, so again, nothing stands in his way. The former residents themselves have waited so long. They've endured pain and suffering as a result of the abuse for years and years. They simply want to be heard. So, Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Premier, with the support of the Home, will the Premier stop stalling on this decision and allow former residents their voice?
Honourable the Premier.
I realize the member was a little bit stumped when he actually got the answer the first time I stood up, which was that the inquiries take all kinds of different shapes and sizes. They include all kinds of things. They exclude all kinds of things. The question is always, what is an appropriate response? Now, Mr. Speaker, it should be obvious from the things that we have seen reported in the press that this involves a great number of people who are in pain. It also involves a well-respected institution in a community that has had the broad support of that community for many, many, many years. They state in their press release they have this concern that they would support a method of inquiry so long as it not interfere with the ongoing investigation into the allegations, and so long as it did not affect the disposition of the class action suit that is before the courts. Now, those are two very important considerations. So if there is to be some kind of a mechanism, some kind of appropriate response to this, then it needs to take into account those facts. And I simply ask the member if he is calling for us on us to do something. I'm not sure that he knows what he's calling on us to do, but if he has some form of inquiry, if he has some terms of reference, if he has some advice about what that would look like, I would just ask him to tender it, and of course we're prepared to look at it.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier's looking for advice, here's some. The Premier could help the former residents in their healing process by developing a commission to look into the possibility of a public forum. It would become the Commission's decision whether or not the forum would in any way impact the court proceedings. He wouldn't have to micromanage it, Mr. Speaker. He wouldn't have to micromanage the Commission in the same manner that he micromanages his backbenchers and his cabinet. So my final question to the Premier, with nothing standing in his way and nothing to hide behind, will the Premier finally take action and tell the former residents they don't need to wait any longer?
There you go. Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we want to make sure that the one thing that is paramount in this discussion, which I think is necessary for all of us to understand, is that the Nova Scotia Home for Coloured Children in that community represented really an iconic institution that provided assistance, help, guidance to many, many, many people. It may turn out, given what we have now seen, the allegations that have been made, that there were some people who were abusive in some form. That would be a tragedy, obviously, for the individuals and for the home. So what we want to do is to be sensitive to all of the interests that are at play here, because it's not, there are individuals who were staff members whose families are still in that community who would have passed away. The question of impinging on their reputation is an important one. The question of getting to the responsibility for the decisions that were made. Mr. Speaker, we have no interest in thwarting a desire by our community. After all, it was not our administration. These were former Conservative and Liberal administrations that made decisions years ago. If the governments of those days were not fulfilling their responsibility, then that is a legitimate question. But the form that takes is important.
The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, early last month, the Colchester Regional Hospital was significantly challenged when all 102 beds in the facility were full. Delayed admissions, backed up emergency care, stretchers in the hallway, and the cancellation of surgeries were the result of this early October bed shortage. Patient flow came to a standstill. This week, the Colchester Regional Hospital is transferring to its new location, a new 124-bed replacement facility. However, Mr. Speaker, we've been told that the new facility will open with 98 beds, despite the fact it has greater capacity. Could the Premier please tell us how a hospital that had experienced significant challenges operating at 102 beds will be able to function at its new location with 4 fewer beds?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is, of course, a state-of-the-art facility, but for a fuller answer on that, I'll just refer it to the Minister of Health.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. No question we're always concerned to ensuring that Nova Scotians have access to the health care service they need, especially when they enter into a hospital, Mr. Speaker. I have full confidence with the investment, the large investment made in this new hospital, Mr. Speaker, that they will be able to service the people that utilize the services within that hospital as we move forward and as they transition to the new facility, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, but I'm not sure the residents of Colchester and East Hants will be pleased with that entirely. According to an update to the community produced in August 2012, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker, a complete outline of the number of beds, totaling 98, was produced. The update reported that unit managers, physicians and team members were working hard to plan for the bed configuration by looking at factors such as bed flow, available staffing resources, patient demographics, and approved funding from the Department of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, could the Premier please tell us whether it was bed flow, available staffing resources, patient demographics, or approved funding from the department that resulted in a 102-bed facility becoming a 98-bed facility? Which factor is it?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is a state-of-the-art facility. It has more capacity. They will be able to, as I understand it, expand or contract in order to meet the need that is there for them. I don't know if the members actually had the opportunity to go to the hospital and to see it, but it is a remarkable institution. It is all designed to create better service to the patients who of that region who have an opportunity to use it. And I can tell you, it was with immense pride that the population served by it came for the grand opening now back a few weeks ago. It was with great pride they recognize not only the accomplishment of the government in investing in this facility, but also the investment made by the community, ensuring that they had a facility which will obviously serve them for many decades to come.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, 17 of the 98 beds at the new facility will be designated as alternate level of care beds, beds dedicated to those awaiting placement in a long-term care facility. Less than 1 month ago, there were 35 of the 102 beds occupied by ALC patients, which we know contributed to the chaos and as a result of government's inaction when it comes to long-term care and continuing care. You don't have to be a mathematician to see that this just won't work. Given that the Premier and his government is not willing to fund more than 98 beds at the new facility, could he please indicate whether consideration was given to maintaining staff at the old Colchester Hospital for the purpose of providing an alternate level of care setting until such time as placements can be made in the community?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, since we've come to power, we have, in fact, increased the number of long-term care beds by a factor of 1,000. We have replaced 900 beds in the communities around the province. Mr. Speaker, this year alone, we have put $22 million additional dollars into home care services in order to allow people to stay in their own homes. This is a commitment to the services that seniors require that I believe is unprecedented. But there is no question, there is a huge demographic push that is taking place in our communities. We are going to be at a point where we have more than 25% of our population over the age of 65 by 2022. And that pushes up through each one of the demographics. It is going to be a challenge over the next number of years as we balance the need for balanced budgets, for lower taxes, and for greater services. This is the balance that the government is charged with the responsibility of making.
The honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thought maybe we can pick up where that one left off. The Minister of Health and Wellness is well aware of the plight of seniors in this province. While in opposition, he was very critical of the progress of the continuing care strategy and wanted to ensure that every bed was approved and opened, Mr. Speaker. His government since then has halted progress on the continuing care strategy. The wait list for long-term care is the highest that it's ever been. Today there are 2,228 seniors waiting for the minister's aid. He's left 371 seniors waiting in valuable hospital beds, which is impacting health care services across this province. So my question to the minister, will the minister explain today how and when he took his place as Minister of Health and Wellness, how did he forget about more than 2,228 seniors waiting for a safe place to call home?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite couldn't be more wrong in some of the figures that he brought forward in his first question, Mr. Speaker. No question, when we took over government, we were, one, left with a financial mess, but two, recognize that seniors, especially seniors in our province, needed to have options when it comes to long-term care and home care, Mr. Speaker, something that they ignored for many, many years. The reason we're in the mess we're in now, Mr. Speaker, is because governments ignored the fact that we needed to build and refurbish and renovate long-term care facilities. And today, Mr. Speaker, we're along the route to ensure that Nova Scotians have options, not only for long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker, but one of the most important options, Mr. Speaker, and that's the option of staying home as long as they can, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Argyle.
Well, thank you very much. On November 9th, 2006, while in opposition, the member for Sackville-Cobequid painted a vivid picture of the seniors waiting for long-term care. I was a pretty good member back then. Keep in mind, Mr. Speaker, that at the time there were 1,035 fewer people waiting than there are today. The member said, and I quote, and I'll table that answer, while this government plays political games with nursing home beds, seniors in our communities across the province are waiting. They're waiting in hospital beds. They're waiting in transitional units. They're waiting in their homes for months and months.
I didn't think so.
When it comes to playing political games,
no.
Mr. Speaker, with the lives of seniors, nobody does it any better than this government. My question, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to ask the same question that the minister asked back in 2006. How much longer is his government going to make seniors in our province wait for the care they badly need?
Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I was right back then when I said they played political games when it came to long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to the fact that this government, when we took over, opened collaborative emergency centres, Mr. Speaker, in opposition ridings, something I don't think we would have seen under a former Conservative government, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to ensure that we're addressing the issues in health care where and when they need it, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't matter what riding they are from, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to work to ensure that not only we replace long-term care facilities, Mr. Speaker, but we ensure that seniors have options. And their first option, if you ask any senior, they would rather be in their homes, Mr. Speaker. That's why we invested an additional $22 million this year for home care services and home care support, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're giving more options for seniors, Mr. Speaker. Because yesterday I announced that we're going to roll out the Home Again program, a very successful program that was here in Capital Health across the province, Mr. Speaker, an intensive program to get people out of the hospital into their homes so that they have support from home care services, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're doing over on this side, Mr. Speaker, something that they should have done when they were in government for 10 long years, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Argyle on his final supplementary.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that question because it really underlines the issue of offering options to Nova Scotia seniors. But the truth is here that the minister is ignoring those who need nursing home beds and insist that home care is a one-size-fits-all solution, which we know full well that home care doesn't fit all situations, as they continue to try to say in this House. We want to give every senior who is able to stay in their home the ability to do that. Of course we do, Mr. Speaker. However, the fact is that the Department of Health and Wellness has assessed more than 2,000 seniors as needing more service than that. Over 2,000 seniors, Mr. Speaker. Then to say that home care is the answer for everyone, I think, Mr. Speaker, is irresponsible. The minister is going against the professional assessments of his own continuing care coordinators. They've assessed those individuals to go to long-term care, and of course they're waiting for that today. We believe seniors deserve more than this government is absolutely willing to provide. So my question to the minister is, will the minister admit to Nova Scotians that he stopped standing up for Nova Scotia seniors?
Order. The time allotted for members' questions to ministers has expired. I will now recognize the honourable leader of the official opposition.
Speaker, rise on a point of order. During question period, the Premier somehow suggested that I had not been filing my expenses, Mr. Speaker. I want to be very clear with all members of this House that not only have I filed my expenses at any media outlet, and some have, Mr. Speaker, have come to my office and I've showed them my expenses, Mr. Speaker. And I also want to remind all members of this House, Mr. Speaker, that the Auditor General reviewed my expenses, and nowhere did he find a $2,000 camera, 2 laptops for $5,000, or an extender for $10,000.
Order. Order. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you review answer, Mr. Speaker, which I respect you will, that you'll find the question was his leader's expenses, and if there's an issue with them, he can table his leader's expenses.